Modern society loves to separate things into neat boxes. Doctors over here, soldiers over there. Science versus strength, healing versus fighting. But in ancient villages across England, those lines didn't exist the way we think they did. Warriors and healers weren't opposites. They were partners in a dance of survival that would make modern medical teams look uncoordinated. Picture a cold morning in 850 CE, somewhere in the rolling hills of what would become Yorkshire. Smoke rises from timber halls. The air smells of wet earth and wood fires. A young warrior named Aelfric limps through the village gate, blood seeping through the linen wrapped around his thigh. He doesn't head to a separate medical building. There isn't one. Instead, he walks directly to a small roundhouse where an older woman named Eadgith tends her herbs. Here's where it gets interesting. Eadgith isn't just waiting around to patch people up. She's been tracking Aelfric's raiding party since they left 3 days ago. She knew which routes they'd take, what injuries were likely, and she'd already prepared specific treatments. The relationship between warrior and healer started long before the wound happened. Most people imagine ancient healers as mystical figures mumbling over potions. That's nonsense. Eadgith was a scientist working with limited tools. She'd spent decades cataloguing which plants stopped bleeding fastest, which prevented infection, which eased pain without clouding judgment. She tested everything on herself first. Her knowledge came from observation, failure, and brutal honesty about what worked. But here's what makes this relationship remarkable. Aelfric didn't just show up for treatment and leave. He sat with Eadgith for hours, describing exactly how the injury happened, the angle of the blade, the depth of the cut, whether it hit during a forward thrust or defensive move. This wasn't casual conversation, it was data collection. Eadgith needed to understand combat mechanics to improve her treatments. Aelfric needed to understand healing limitations to adjust his fighting techniques. They spoke the same language of survival. When Eadgith explained that wounds to certain parts of the leg healed slower because of muscle movement, Aelfric adjusted his defensive stance. When Aelfric described how certain armor designs created pressure points that turned minor cuts into major problems, Eadgith modified her treatment approach. Neither one operated in isolation. The respect flowed both ways. Warriors protected healers not out of obligation, but because they understood their value. A skilled healer could mean the difference between a raiding party returning home or being buried in foreign soil. Healers, in turn, never took warriors for granted. They saw the psychological toll of combat, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way hands shook hours after battle ended. Treatment wasn't just about closing wounds, it was about keeping minds intact. Here's something that would shock most people. Many healers in these villages were former warriors. Injury or age had ended their fighting days, but their knowledge of combat made them better at healing combat wounds. They understood the fear, the adrenaline, the way pain manifested differently in battle than in everyday accidents. This crossover created a medical system that was remarkably sophisticated despite lacking modern technology. The village structure itself reinforced this relationship. Unlike modern cities where hospitals are separate institutions, ancient English villages integrated healing into daily life. Eadgith's roundhouse sat near the central meeting area, not on the outskirts. Warriors passed it multiple times daily. Young fighters learned herb identification alongside sword techniques. Children grew up seeing healing and fighting as complementary skills, not opposing philosophies. Training reflected this integration. Teenage boys learning combat also learned basic wound care, not because they'd become healers, but because battlefields don't come with medical staff. If your shield brother took an arrow, you needed to know how to stop the bleeding long enough to get him home. Similarly, healers' apprentices learned about weapons and armor. You can't treat a wound effectively if you don't understand how it was created. The economic relationship mattered too. Warriors didn't pay for healing in coin. Money barely existed in most of these villages. Instead, they provided protection, helped with heavy labor, and brought back rare materials from raids. That last part was crucial. Many of the most effective medicinal plants didn't grow in England. Healers needed warriors to acquire them from distant lands. A successful raid might bring back not just silver, but packets of herbs worth more than gold to someone like Eadgith. Communication between warriors and healers had to be precise. There was no room for ego or miscommunication when lives hung in the balance. Warriors learned to describe pain accurately. Not "it hurts," but "sharp pain when I bend, dull throb when still." Healers learned to explain limitations honestly. This will reduce infection risk, but won't eliminate it completely. Both sides valued truth over comfort. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because the next 5 chapters reveal how these ancient partnerships developed psychological techniques, crisis management systems, and community integration methods that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand. The relationship between Aelfric and Idgith wasn't unique. It was the model every warrior-healer pair in the village followed. But what made it work wasn't just skill or proximity. It was a language they'd developed over years, a way of communicating that went far beyond words. Edgith could read a warrior's walk from 30 paces. The way Aelfric favored his left side meant his right shoulder was compensating for an old injury. The slight hesitation before sitting indicated lower back pain he hadn't mentioned. These weren't guesses. They were patterns she'd observed in hundreds of fighters over decades. Modern doctors might call it clinical intuition. Idgith called it paying attention. Warriors developed their own reading skills. They could tell when a healer was confident about a treatment versus when they were experimenting. The difference showed in how firmly hands moved, how quickly decisions were made, whether the healer asked questions or issued instructions. In a world without medical textbooks or standardized procedures, reading your healer's confidence level could save your life. Trust, built slowly, almost invisibly. It started with small things. Edgith might prepare a warrior's favorite meal after a difficult treatment, knowing he'd need familiar comfort. Aelfric might bring her firewood without being asked, understanding she couldn't gather it herself while tending patients. These tiny exchanges created a foundation that held steady when crises hit. The village had maybe 200 people. Everyone knew everyone, which meant reputation mattered more than credentials. A healer who lost too many patients wouldn't get a second chance, no matter how well they explained the odds. A warrior who ignored a healer's instructions and worsened their injury became a cautionary tale. The social pressure to maintain these relationships properly was intense. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. Warriors and healers often developed relationships that looked like friendship, but operated on different rules. They shared intimate knowledge. Healers saw warriors at their most vulnerable. Warriors trusted healers with their lives, yet maintained professional boundaries that kept the dynamic functional. Modern therapists would recognize this as a specialized form of therapeutic alliance. Though neither party would have used that term, consider what happened when a treatment failed. If a warrior died despite Edgith's best efforts, the village didn't blame her automatically. Other warriors who'd received her care would speak up, explaining that some wounds simply couldn't be survived. This communal understanding prevented the blame cycles that destroy medical communities today. Everyone accepted that death was part of life, even when it hurt. The reverse also held true. If a warrior's recklessness caused an injury, healers would say so publicly, not to shame but to educate. Other young fighters needed to see the connection between foolish choices and painful consequences. Edgith might tend Aelfric's wound while simultaneously describing to watching apprentices exactly what mistake led to it. This blunt honesty prevented repeated errors and kept warriors humble. Pain management created its own language. Ancient England had no morphine, no anesthesia beyond alcohol and certain herbs. Warriors learned to breathe through procedures that would make modern patients scream. Healers learned to work quickly, to explain what they were doing in advance so the patient could mentally prepare, to recognize when pain crossed from tolerable to traumatic. Both sides understood that managing pain was a collaborative effort. The concept of informed consent existed, though not by that name. Before any major treatment, Idgith would explain the options, the risks, and her honest assessment of success chances. Aelfric could refuse treatment and die with his wound, or accept it and possibly die anyway, or possibly survive. The choice remained his, always. This respect for patient autonomy might surprise people who think ancient societies were more authoritarian than modern ones. Healers also served as emotional regulators for warriors. After battle, men might sit in Edgith's roundhouse for hours, not talking, just being present in a space that felt safe. She understood they needed time to shift from the hyper-arousal of combat to the regulated state required for village life. Modern psychology calls this transitional space. Eadgith just called it necessary. The relationships could become complicated when warriors and healers were family. In many villages, healing knowledge passed from parent to child, just like fighting skills. A mother might treat her warrior son's wounds while simultaneously processing her fear of losing him. These dual roles required extraordinary emotional discipline. The personal and professional had to coexist without one overwhelming the other. Young warriors often developed intense attachments to their healers. Not romantic, though that happened sometimes, but something closer to what modern psychology might call a secure attachment figure. The healer represented safety in a dangerous world. Their voice became associated with pain ending, with survival, with returning home. Warriors who lost their trusted healer often struggled to bond with a new one. 3 years after Aelfric's first major injury, something happened that tested every warrior-healer relationship in the village. A raiding party returned with 12 wounded men instead of the usual 2 or 3. They'd been ambushed by a larger force. Wounds ranged from minor cuts to catastrophic injuries that required immediate intervention. Eadgith took one look at the situation and made a decision that would define her legacy. Instead of treating warriors in order of severity or social rank, she performed what modern medicine calls triage. She identified who could be saved, who would die regardless of treatment, and who fell in the middle. Then she focused all resources on the savable middle group. This meant looking a dying warrior in the eyes and saying, "I cannot help you. I'm sorry." It meant walking past men screaming in agony to treat someone with quieter but more treatable wounds. It meant making peace with the fact that mercy sometimes looked like abandonment. The psychological weight of those choices aged her visibly. But here's what made the system work. The warriors understood. They'd seen enough combat to know that sometimes you have to leave the dead to save the living. When Eadgith passed by a mortally wounded man to treat someone else, his companions didn't protest. They sat with him, held his hand, and let him die surrounded by friends, while the healer saved those who could be saved. If you're watching this and feeling the weight of that decision, comment, "Some choices have no right answer." Let me know you understand the impossible positions these people faced. Other healers arrived to help. The village had several people with medical knowledge, though Eadgith was most skilled. They'd never worked together on this scale before. Coordination became crucial. Who treated which patient? How were limited supplies divided? Who made final calls when opinions differed? They developed an instant hierarchy based purely on competence. Eadgith directed the operation not because of age or status, but because everyone trusted her judgment most. Younger healers deferred to her decisions without ego. Warriors followed instructions from whichever healer was treating them, even if that healer was barely 20 years old. The crisis stripped away social niceties and revealed the functional core of these relationships. The psychological impact on healers was profound. Treating 1 or 2 patients allowed for careful attention and emotional processing. Treating 12 simultaneously meant operating in a state of controlled detachment. Eadgith later described it as seeing bodies instead of people. She had to, temporarily, or the emotional weight would have paralyzed her. Warriors understood this shift and didn't take it personally. Supply limitations forced brutal choices. The village had limited quantities of certain herbs. Using them all on one patient with questionable survival odds meant condemning others with better chances. Eadgith had to calculate not just medical factors, but social ones. Losing a village leader had different consequences than losing a young, unmarried warrior. Modern medical ethics would recoil at this calculation. Ancient village survival required it. The crisis lasted 3 days. Some patients needed constant monitoring. Others required treatments every few hours. Eadgith and her fellow healers barely slept. Warriors not injured enough to need treatment rotated through to help, holding patients down during painful procedures, fetching water, keeping fires going, preparing food. The entire village mobilized around the healing effort. 7 of the 12 survived. 5 died. Modern medicine might save 10 or 11 with similar injuries, but judging ancient healers by modern standards misses the point. Given their tools and knowledge, saving more than half was extraordinary. The village recognized this. The survivors credited Edgith with their lives. The families of the dead thanked her for trying. Here's what changed after that crisis. The relationships between warriors and healers deepened from practical partnerships into something closer to sacred bonds. Warriors who'd watched Edgith work for 3 days straight, making impossible decisions with steady hands, understood her value in a way they hadn't before. She wasn't just useful, she was essential to their way of life. The crisis also revealed gaps in the system. The village needed more trained healers. They needed better supply stockpiles. They needed clearer protocols for mass casualty events. In the weeks following, the community made changes. More apprentices began training. Storage buildings were organized to keep medical supplies readily accessible. Warriors and healers conducted drills, practicing coordination before the next crisis hit. Edgith's relationship with Aelfric evolved too. He'd been one of the 12 wounded, a moderate injury she'd treated quickly before moving to others. Watching her work, seeing her make terrible choices with clear eyes, gave him perspective on every treatment she'd ever given him. He understood now that healing wasn't just about knowing plants and anatomy. It was about carrying the weight of life and death without collapsing. The crisis convinced the village to take training more seriously. Edgith took on 3 new apprentices simultaneously, an unprecedented number. Among them was a 16-year-old named Oswin, who'd previously trained as a warrior, but showed more aptitude for healing. Teaching revealed another dimension of the warrior-healer relationship. Oswin brought combat knowledge that helped him understand injuries from the inside. He knew how a shield strike felt, where armor created vulnerable points, how adrenaline masked pain during fighting. This experiential knowledge made him a better healer than someone who'd only studied from the outside. But he also had to unlearn warrior instincts. Combat rewards quick, decisive action. Healing often requires patience and observation. Warriors think in terms of winning and losing. Healers think in terms of probabilities and margins. The transition wasn't easy. Oswin would rush treatments, trying to fix problems immediately rather than letting the body's natural processes work. Edgith had to teach him that sometimes the best medicine was strategic waiting. The relationship between teacher and student mirrored the warrior-healer dynamic. Edgith didn't coddle Oswin. When he made mistakes, she explained them bluntly, often in front of patients. This public correction might seem harsh, but it served multiple purposes. It prevented repeated errors. It demonstrated to patients that healers held themselves accountable, and it taught Oswin to check his ego at the door. In a field where mistakes kill people, pride was a luxury no one could afford. Other apprentices learned by watching warrior-healer interactions. They saw how Edgith communicated with patients, how she balanced honesty with compassion, how she made warriors feel heard without letting them dictate treatment. These soft skills, modern medicine might call them bedside manner, were as crucial as knowing which plant stopped bleeding. The village's warriors participated actively in training. They allowed apprentices to examine healed wounds, explaining what the injury had felt like and how treatment had progressed. They demonstrated combat techniques slowly, so apprentices could see exactly how injuries occurred. This openness created a learning environment that accelerated skill development. Young warriors also learned from watching healers train. They saw apprentices practice suturing on leather and fabric before touching human skin. They understood that mastery required countless hours of repetition. This knowledge made them more patient with their own combat training and more respectful of healing as a genuine skill rather than something anyone could do. Edgith taught her apprentices to read warriors' psychological states as carefully as physical wounds. A warrior who wouldn't make eye contact might be hiding a more serious injury. One who downplayed pain might be trying to return to combat too quickly. Another who became unusually talkative might be processing trauma. These behavioral patterns carried diagnostic information as valuable as any physical symptom. The economic aspects of training also reinforced warrior-healer relationships. Apprentice healers needed to eat and have shelter while learning, but they couldn't yet provide full services. Warriors often provided for them, understanding this as an investment in future medical care. When Oswin eventually became a full healer, he'd remember which warriors had supported his training. Teaching also meant preparing students for the emotional weight of the profession. Edgith didn't shelter her apprentices from death. When a patient died, she'd discuss it with them afterward, what had been tried, why it failed, how to carry the loss without letting it paralyze future care. Warriors who'd lost comrades would sometimes join these discussions, sharing their own perspectives on death and survival. The cross-training created emotional resilience in both groups. One teaching method particularly stands out. Edgith would have warriors and healer apprentices swap roles for short periods. Warriors would practice identifying injuries and selecting treatments. Apprentices would learn basic self-defense and combat movement. This cross-training didn't make warriors into healers, or healers into warriors, but it built mutual understanding that strengthened their future collaborations. The intergenerational transfer of knowledge relied heavily on oral tradition and demonstration. There were no textbooks, no written protocols. Everything had to be memorized and practiced until it became instinctive. This meant learning relationships were intense and long-lasting. An apprentice might train for 10 years before being considered fully competent. During that decade, the bonds formed between student and teacher, between emerging healers and active warriors, created a social web that held the entire village together. 5 years after the crisis, Edgith fell ill. Not suddenly, the decline came slowly over months. Her hands trembled, her vision dimmed, her legendary stamina faded. For the first time in her adult life, she needed care rather than providing it. The response revealed the true depth of warrior-healer relationships. Ælfric, now in his 30s and one of the village's senior warriors, took charge of her care. He'd spent years watching her work, absorbing not just techniques, but philosophy. Now he applied those lessons back to their source. The role reversal was psychologically complex for both of them. Edgith had always been the strong one, the person others depended on. Accepting vulnerability felt like failure. Ælfric had always been the patient, the recipient of care, providing it required confidence he wasn't sure he possessed. Yet the relationship that had developed over years gave them a foundation to navigate this shift. Ælfric didn't try to become a healer. He knew his limitations. Instead, he coordinated care, bringing in younger healers while staying present himself. His value lay in knowing Edgith personally, her preferences, her fears, her tolerance for pain. He could translate between her stubborn independence and the healers who needed her to follow treatment protocols. Other warriors contributed too. They visited regularly, not with pity, but with respect. They told stories, shared news, kept her connected to village life. They understood instinctively what modern psychology teaches, that social isolation kills as surely as disease. Their presence provided medicine that no herb could match. The younger healers, including Oswin, treated Edgith with a mix of professional competence and personal reverence. They'd learned everything from her. Now they had to treat her with the same blunt honesty she'd taught them to use. When a treatment wasn't working, they said so. When her condition worsened, they didn't sugarcoat it. She'd have been furious at anything less than truth. This period revealed how deeply the warrior-healer relationship had embedded itself in village culture. Children who'd grown up seeing Edgith and Ælfric work together now watched the dynamic reverse. They learned that strength meant knowing when to receive help, not just when to give it. They saw that relationships built on mutual respect could flex and adapt when circumstances changed. Edgith's illness also forced the village to confront succession. She'd trained multiple healers, but none had her experience or authority. The transition wouldn't happen smoothly unless she actively managed it. From her sickbed, she began directing younger healers more explicitly, explaining not just what to do but why, sharing decades of accumulated wisdom while she still could. Warriors participated in this knowledge transfer. They'd share their medical histories with younger healers, giving them practice taking patient histories and diagnosing old injuries. They'd describe Edgith's past treatments, providing case studies that supplemented the younger healer's limited experience. This collaborative education ensured that Edgith's knowledge wouldn't die with her. The emotional toll on everyone was substantial. Warriors who'd survived because of Edgith's skill now had to watch her decline, knowing their presence couldn't save her the way her skills had saved them. Younger healers felt the weight of responsibility shifting onto shoulders not quite ready to bear it. Ælfric carried the specific grief of watching someone he deeply respected slowly fade. Yet the relationship sustained them all. Edgith found meaning in preparing her successors. Warriors found purpose in supporting someone who'd supported them for decades. Younger healers gained confidence from being trusted with their mentor's care. The bonds that had been built over years of treating battle wounds now proved strong enough to carry them through a different kind of crisis. Edgith lived for 2 more years after her illness began, far longer than anyone expected. Multiple factors contributed: her knowledge of her own condition, the skilled care of her students, the emotional support of the warrior community. But perhaps most importantly, she had reasons to keep living. Students still needed teaching. Relationships still needed tending. Her work wasn't finished. When she finally died, the entire village mourned, but they also celebrated. Her legacy lived in the healers she'd trained, the warriors she'd saved, the relationships she'd fostered. The model she'd established, warriors and healers as true partners rather than separate castes, had become so embedded in village culture that it would outlast her by generations. 10 years after Edgith's death, her influence remained visible in every aspect of village life. Oswin had become the primary healer, but he led differently than his mentor. Where Edgith had worked mostly alone, Oswin built teams. Warriors with medical knowledge formed a semi-formal corps that could respond to crises more efficiently than ever before. Aelfric, now too old for raiding, served as a bridge between warriors and healers. His dual perspective, having been both patient and caregiver, made him invaluable for training younger people in both fields. He taught combat students about injury prevention and healing students about warrior psychology. The integration Edgith had practiced informally became institutionalized under his guidance. The village's approach to warrior-healer relationships had evolved into something remarkable. Young people weren't tracked into either warrior or healer paths. They were expected to develop competence in both. Every warrior learned advanced first aid. Every healer learned enough about combat to understand the injuries they'd treat. The artificial separation that defined most societies never took root here. This integration produced unexpected benefits. Warriors who understood healing were better at preventing injuries in the first place. They designed better armor, developed safer training methods, and took calculated risks instead of reckless ones. Healers who understood combat could anticipate injuries before they happened and prepare accordingly. The synergy made the entire village more resilient. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Children grew up seeing healing and fighting as complementary rather than contradictory. They learned that strength came in multiple forms: the strength to wound and the strength to heal, the courage to fight and the courage to care. These lessons shaped their character in ways that extended far beyond medicine or combat. The economic model had also matured. The village now allocated specific resources to healing: dedicated buildings, stockpiled supplies, designated personnel. Warriors contributed a portion of raid proceeds to maintaining this system. The arrangement formalized what had once been informal mutual support, ensuring that resources would be available even when personal relationships shifted. Visitors from other villages noticed the difference immediately. Injured traders passing through received care that exceeded anything they'd experienced elsewhere. Neighboring communities began sending their own healer apprentices to train here. The reputation spread. The village became known not for its warriors' fierceness or its healers' skill individually, but for the partnership between them. Modern readers might wonder what happened when conflict arose between warriors and healers. It did, occasionally. A warrior might want to return to combat before a healer cleared them. A healer might recommend treatment a warrior found too expensive or time-consuming. But the village had developed dispute resolution methods that honored both perspectives. Neutral elders would mediate, bringing in experienced people from both sides to reach compromises that prioritized community welfare over individual preferences. The model also adapted to changing circumstances. As the village grew, the warrior-healer partnership scaled. More healers meant more specialized knowledge, one focused on combat injuries, another on illnesses, a third on childbirth. Warriors developed corresponding specializations. Scouts worked with healers interested in wilderness medicine. Craftsmen collaborated with those studying tool-related injuries. Farmers partnered with healers addressing agricultural accidents. Perhaps most importantly, The culture preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. When a healer grew old, they didn't simply retire. They became living libraries, teaching anyone who would listen. Warriors who'd survived unusual injuries shared their experiences, adding data points to the collective medical knowledge. The community valued practical wisdom regardless of its source, creating a learning environment that constantly improved. The emotional bonds between warriors and healers remained strong across generations. Young warriors still formed deep attachments to their healers. Healers still grieved their patients' deaths personally. But the community now recognized these relationships as healthy and necessary rather than something to be hidden or downplayed. The village had learned what modern psychology is still figuring out, that professional relationships can be deeply personal without becoming dysfunctional. Helfrich, in his final years, reflected on the journey. He'd watched the relationship between warriors and healers evolve from practical necessity to cultural cornerstone. He'd seen how Edgith's insistence on mutual respect and honest communication had rippled outward, shaping not just medical care but the village's entire social structure. Her legacy wasn't just the lives she'd saved, but the community she'd helped build. The warrior-healer partnership that had begun with simple exchanges, protection for treatment, supplies for knowledge, had grown into something far more profound. It became a model for how different skills and perspectives could complement rather than compete. It demonstrated that strength and compassion weren't opposites but partners. It proved that survival required both the ability to wound and the ability to heal, and that communities thrived when they honored both equally. If you watched this far, it's because you connected with this story of partnership and mutual respect. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and understand who really appreciates the stories on this channel." Before you go, if this story made you think differently about strength, vulnerability, and partnership, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember that true power comes from knowing when to fight and when to heal, when to be strong and when to accept help. The secrets of relationships between warriors and healers in ancient villages weren't really secrets at all. They were lessons in mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that every strength requires a complementary skill. These ancient communities figured out what modern society is still learning, that caring for each other isn't weakness, and needing help isn't failure. It's simply being human.